They thought they were about to welcome a mistake into the mansion, but before the week was over, every one of them would be forced to question what dignity truly looked like. The black SUV rolled through the towering wrought iron gates just after 8 o'clock on a cool Monday morning, its polished surface reflecting the golden rays of the rising sun that stretched across the sprawling Castellano estate outside Chicago. Gardeners paused beside perfectly trimmed hedges. Security guards exchanged curious glances through their earpieces. Even the kitchen staff standing near the service entrance slowed their morning routines as the unfamiliar vehicle came to a smooth stop in front of the mansion's grand staircase. Dominic Castellano rarely hired new household staff himself. When he did, the decision usually followed weeks of background checks, recommendations, and interviews handled by trusted managers. That was why every pair of eyes watched with growing confusion as the rear passenger door quietly opened. Naomi Carter stepped onto the gravel driveway carrying nothing more than a worn leather duffel bag that had clearly traveled with her for years. At 27, she stood with quiet confidence despite the uncertainty waiting ahead. Her dark skin glowed softly beneath the morning sunlight, her natural curls neatly tied back into a simple bun, and her navy blue dress, though inexpensive, had been carefully pressed the night before. The polished mansion towering above her looked like another world entirely, all white stone, towering columns, and windows that caught the morning light like mirrors. For a brief second, Naomi simply looked up, taking in the enormous home where she hoped honest work might finally give her the fresh start she had spent years chasing. She never noticed the whispers beginning around her. Seriously? One housekeeper muttered beneath her breath. She's the new hire? Another employee folded his arms. The boss picked her himself. A valet quietly shook his head. She won't last 3 days. Their words floated through the crisp morning air like invisible arrows. Naomi had heard versions of them before. Different cities, different jobs, different faces. The words always sounded the same. She tightened her grip on her bag, but kept walking, her expression calm, refusing to give strangers the satisfaction of seeing disappointment in her eyes. Inside the mansion, polished marble floors reflected sparkling chandeliers, while portraits of generations past watched silently from the walls. Every detail whispered wealth, discipline, and power. Standing near the entrance was Eleanor Whitmore, the estate's longtime head housekeeper. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, her uniform immaculate, and her posture carried decades of unquestioned authority. She looked Naomi up and down without offering so much as a smile. "You're late," Eleanor said coldly. Naomi glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing beside the staircase. "It's 7:58, ma'am." Eleanor's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then don't make me wait another second. Follow me." Several employees nearby exchanged amused looks, already sensing exactly how this story would unfold. They assumed the young woman walking quietly behind Eleanor had no idea what kind of house she had entered. They believed she would soon learn her place like everyone else. What none of them realized was that another set of eyes had been watching from the second-floor balcony since the moment the SUV entered the estate. Dominic Castellano stood perfectly still behind the tall windows, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, one hand resting lightly against the polished railing. His expression revealed nothing as his sharp gray eyes followed Naomi's every step from the driveway to the front entrance. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look disappointed. He simply watched with the quiet patience of a man who noticed details everyone else overlooked. As Eleanor disappeared with Naomi into the east hallway, one of Dominic's senior advisors stepped beside him and spoke carefully. "Sir, with all due respect, are you certain she's the right choice?" Dominic never looked away from the hallway below. After several long seconds, he answered with only 4 quiet words. "She stays. That's final." Downstairs, no one heard his decision. They only saw a new maid. Walking deeper into the mansion, completely unaware that her first test had already begun. Naomi followed Eleanor through hallways so immaculate that every polished surface reflected the morning light like glass. Yet despite the beauty surrounding her, the atmosphere felt strangely cold. Every employee they passed seemed to stop whatever they were doing just long enough to glance at the newest maid before quietly returning to work. Some smiled politely, but their eyes carried silent judgment. Others did not bother hiding their curiosity at all. Eleanor never slowed her pace. You will report at 6 o'clock every morning, she said without turning around. Breakfast service begins at 7. Every room on the east wing must be cleaned before noon. Lunch is at exactly 12:30. You will never enter the private offices unless instructed. You will never speak during business meetings. You will never interrupt Mr. Castellano unless he addresses you first. Is that understood? Naomi nodded respectfully. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor stopped outside a narrow staff hallway and opened a plain wooden door. Inside sat a modest room with a single bed, a dresser, a reading lamp, and one small window overlooking the gardens. Compared to the mansion itself, the room was simple, but Naomi smiled quietly. It was clean, peaceful, and more comfortable than several apartments she had rented over the years. You should consider yourself fortunate, Eleanor said flatly. Many applicants wanted this position. Naomi placed her duffel bag beside the bed. I appreciate the opportunity. Eleanor studied her for a brief moment, almost surprised that no complaint had followed. Be downstairs in 5 minutes. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Naomi took one slow breath before looking around the room again. She carefully removed a framed photograph from her bag and placed it on the dresser. It showed her standing beside her late grandmother, both smiling beneath the summer sun years earlier. Naomi rested her fingertips gently against the frame. I will make this work, she whispered before returning downstairs. The kitchen was already alive with activity. Pots simmered. Fresh bread filled the air with warmth. Servers hurried between counters carrying silver trays, while chefs called out instructions with practiced efficiency. As Naomi entered, several conversations quietly faded. One young server looked her over before leaning toward another employee. She looks nervous. The other shrugged. Give it until Friday. A dishwasher chuckled softly. I am guessing Wednesday. Naomi pretended not to hear any of it. Instead, she walked directly toward an older cook struggling to carry a heavy container across the floor. May I help you? She asked. The woman hesitated before handing it over. Thank you. Naomi carried the container without another word and returned immediately to organizing breakfast dishes. No one acknowledged the small act. No one thanked her. They simply accepted it as though it had always been expected. Hours passed quickly. Naomi polished silverware, folded linen napkins, prepared guest rooms, and quietly memorized the endless layout of the estate. She noticed details others ignored, straightening a crooked family portrait in the hallway, watering a neglected fern near the library, carefully placing a child's forgotten storybook back onto a sitting room shelf instead of leaving it on the floor. Each task was completed with the same quiet care, even though no one appeared to notice. Shortly before noon, Naomi carried fresh towels toward the west corridor when she heard two housekeepers speaking just beyond the laundry room. They had not realized she was nearby. Do you know what I heard? One whispered. The boss hired her personally. The other laughed softly. That only means he will fire her personally too. Naomi slowed for only a heartbeat before continuing down the hallway with steady footsteps. Their words lingered in the silence behind her, but her expression never changed. High above the corridor, behind the partially open door of his private study, Dominic Castellano looked down from the second-floor balcony once again. His advisor stood nearby reviewing schedules without noticing where Dominic's attention had settled. Far below, Naomi bent to pick up a stack of folded towels another employee had accidentally dropped before quietly returning them without expecting recognition. Dominic watched the exchange in complete silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth shifted into the faintest hint of approval before disappearing just as quickly, unseen by everyone in the mansion. By the third morning, Naomi had learned something that no employee handbook could ever teach. The mansion did not run on schedules alone. It ran on quiet hierarchies, invisible lines that everyone respected without question. Some people spoke first. Others waited to be spoken to. Some entered through the grand halls. Others disappeared through service corridors that guests never noticed. Naomi accepted every rule without complaint, moving through each day with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through every difficult chapter of her life. Long before sunrise, she was already preparing breakfast trays, polishing crystal glasses until they caught the first light of dawn, and arranging fresh flowers throughout the estate. She never rushed. She never cut corners. She treated every task, no matter how small, as though someone important would eventually notice. Most people did not. Around her, conversations still stopped whenever she entered a room. At lunch, the household staff naturally gathered around familiar tables, while Naomi quietly carried her tray to a small seat beside the kitchen window overlooking the gardens. No one invited her to join them. No one told her to leave either. She simply understood where she belonged, at least for now. Across the room, two young servers watched her from a distance. "She still smiles," one whispered. "Give it another week." The other shook his head. "Everyone loses that smile eventually." Naomi heard every word, but instead of reacting, she unfolded the napkin across her lap and finished her meal with quiet dignity. After lunch, Eleanor handed her a list of additional assignments. The West Library, the upstairs gallery, and Mr. Castellano's conference room after the meeting ends. Be careful with everything inside. Naomi accepted the list with a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am." The West Library was unlike any room she had ever cleaned. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stretched toward an ornate ceiling painted decades earlier. Sunlight poured through towering windows, warming polished oak floors that smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. She dusted each shelf carefully, straightened every chair, and gently aligned books that had been returned unevenly. On a nearby table sat an antique chessboard with one piece resting on the floor beside it. Naomi picked it up, studied the board for a second, then quietly returned the knight to its proper square before continuing her work. She never realized someone had been standing just beyond the doorway. Dominic Castellano had entered without making a sound, accompanied by his longtime advisor, Victor Hale. Victor began discussing investment reports scheduled for later that afternoon, but Dominic's attention lingered on the young maid adjusting a curtain that had been hanging unevenly by less than an inch. She stepped back, examined the room, noticed a tiny fingerprint on the polished glass cabinet, and carefully wiped it away before leaving exactly as quietly as she had entered. "She notices everything," Dominic said almost to himself. Victor glanced toward the empty library. "Sir." Dominic looked away. "Nothing." They continued toward the conference room, but Victor sensed something unusual. Dominic rarely commented on employees, especially new ones. Yet over the next several days, the pattern continued. Naomi was never where people expected recognition, but somehow Dominic always seemed to notice the moments no one else did. He saw her return a gardener's forgotten jacket before the afternoon rain arrived. He watched her quietly repair a loose button on an elderly cook's uniform during her break. He noticed that every room she cleaned somehow felt warmer, not because she changed the furniture, but because she restored little details others had stopped seeing. The rest of the staff remained convinced the boss barely knew she existed. In whispered conversations, they joked that she had become invisible. Ironically, the one person who truly saw her was the only man in the mansion who never spoke a word about it. And while everyone else believed Naomi was simply trying to survive her first week, Dominic had already begun asking himself a very different question. Was everyone judging the wrong person? The first Friday at the estate arrived with unusual energy. Luxury sedans rolled through the front gates one after another as assistants hurried across the marble entrance carrying garment bags, floral arrangements, and polished silver trays. Dominic Castellano was hosting a private charity dinner that evening, one attended by respected business leaders, community organizers, and longtime family friends. Every employee understood that perfection was expected. Even the smallest mistake would become tomorrow's conversation. Naomi received her assignments before sunrise. She was responsible for preparing the East Reception Hall, refreshing guest rooms, assisting the dining staff between courses, and making sure every sitting room remained spotless throughout the evening. Eleanor reviewed the checklist without looking up. "Today is not the day to make yourself noticeable." Naomi answered with the same quiet respect she always carried. "I understand." By late afternoon, the mansion had transformed. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors. Fresh white roses filled every room with a gentle fragrance. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while chefs completed the final preparations in the enormous kitchen. Guests soon began arriving, filling the grand foyer with elegant conversations and warm laughter. Naomi moved carefully among them, collecting empty glasses, adjusting chairs, and quietly ensuring everything remained orderly without interrupting a single conversation. To most people, she was simply another member of the household staff. Near the dining room entrance, a senior server named Bradley watched Naomi for several moments before leaning toward two coworkers. The boss has not said one word to her all week, he whispered with a smug smile. I told you she was nothing special. One of the others nodded. She acts like she belongs here. Bradley quietly picked up a half-empty glass of sparkling water from a nearby table. As Naomi approached carrying a silver serving tray, he shifted, just enough to brush against her shoulder. The glass tipped, sending water across the front of Naomi's uniform and splashing onto the polished floor. Several nearby guests turned at the unexpected sound. Bradley immediately raised both hands. Oh no, you should really watch where you are going. Naomi looked down at the water soaking into the dark fabric before calmly setting her tray onto a nearby table. I am sorry for the inconvenience, she said softly, even though she knew exactly what had happened. A few employees exchanged amused smiles while pretending to help clean the floor. One guest quietly shook his head before turning back to his conversation, assuming the young maid had simply been careless. Naomi accepted a towel from another server, wiped the floor carefully, and excused herself to change into a clean uniform. Not once did she defend herself. Not once did she accuse Bradley. From the second-floor gallery overlooking the reception hall, Dominic stood beside Victor Hale, speaking with two guests about upcoming charitable projects. Midway through the conversation, his eyes drifted toward the scene below. He watched Bradley's subtle movement. He watched Naomi apologize without complaint. He watched the expressions on every employee standing nearby. Dominic returned his attention to the conversation without saying a single word. Victor noticed the brief glance. Everything all right, sir? Dominic adjusted the cuff of his charcoal jacket. Perfectly. Downstairs, Bradley smiled to himself, convinced the incident had ended exactly as he expected. Naomi returned a few minutes later wearing a fresh uniform identical to the first one and quietly resumed her work as though nothing had happened. Yet something invisible had shifted inside the mansion. While nearly everyone believed they had witnessed an embarrassing mistake by the newest maid, one man had seen something entirely different. And for the first time since Naomi arrived, Dominic Castellano was no longer simply observing. He was waiting. The evening settled into an elegant rhythm as conversations drifted beneath sparkling chandeliers, and the soft melody of a grand piano floated through the mansion like a gentle breeze. Waiters moved gracefully between round tables dressed in crisp white linen, while candles flickered against polished crystal, casting warm reflections across smiling faces. Naomi continued her work with the same quiet focus she had shown since her first day. She refilled water glasses before anyone needed to ask, straightened chairs after guests stood to greet one another, and somehow seemed to anticipate every small need before it became visible. Few people noticed. Those who did simply assumed it was luck. Bradley, however, had no intention of letting the newest maid finish the evening with her dignity intact. As dessert was being prepared, he quietly gathered 3 other employees near the service hallway. She thinks working hard will impress everyone, he muttered. Let us see how calm she stays when the boss believes she ruined his biggest event. One of the younger servers looked uncertain. Maybe we should leave it alone. Bradley smiled confidently. Relax. Nobody will blame us. A few minutes later, Naomi entered the preparation room to collect a silver tray carrying handcrafted desserts decorated with fresh berries and edible flowers. The pastry chef carefully positioned each plate before nodding. Take these directly to the main dining room. Naomi smiled warmly. Thank you. She lifted the tray with steady hands and walked toward the ballroom. As she passed through the narrow service corridor, Bradley deliberately stepped backward while pretending to organize serving utensils. At the same moment, another employee quietly rolled an empty utility cart into Naomi's path. Forced to stop suddenly, Naomi shifted her weight to keep the tray perfectly balanced. One dessert plate slid gently toward the edge. Before it could fall, Naomi caught it with remarkable composure, protecting every plate without spilling a single decoration. The hallway fell silent. Bradley had expected embarrassment. Instead, every dessert remained flawless. His expression hardened. Thinking quickly, he picked up a folded linen napkin from a nearby counter and casually brushed it against one dessert, leaving a faint chocolate smear along the edge of the white porcelain plate. Look what happened, he announced loudly enough for nearby staff to hear. She almost ruined the entire presentation. Several employees immediately turned toward Naomi. She looked down at the tiny mark on the plate, then quietly placed the tray onto a nearby serving station. Without defending herself, she picked up a clean cloth, carefully polished the edge until it looked perfect again, and calmly replaced the dessert exactly where it belonged. "Everything is ready now," she said softly. Bradley laughed under his breath. "You should be thanking me for catching your mistake." Naomi simply lifted the tray once more and continued toward the dining room. Behind her, whispers spread quickly through the staff. By the time dessert reached the guests, the story had already changed. Some claimed Naomi had nearly dropped every plate. Others insisted she had almost embarrassed the household in front of important visitors. The truth quietly disappeared beneath confident assumptions. At the head of the ballroom, Dominic greeted several guests before taking his seat. His expression remained composed as servers delivered dessert with perfect timing. Naomi placed the final plate before an elderly philanthropist who smiled kindly. "Thank you, young lady." "You are very welcome, sir," Naomi replied with quiet grace before stepping away. Dominic watched the exchange without interrupting the conversation around him. Then his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly toward the security camera mounted above the service hallway entrance. Victor noticed the brief glance. "Is something wrong?" Dominic reached for his coffee cup, but never looked away from the camera for more than a heartbeat. "No," he answered calmly. "Something is finally becoming very clear." Across the room, Bradley relaxed, convinced his plan had worked once again. He never imagined that the only version of the story Dominic Castellano intended to believe was the one recorded by silent eyes that never blinked. The charity dinner ended without a single guest realizing that the most important conversation of the evening had never taken place in the ballroom. As luxury cars disappeared beyond the estate gates and the last crystal glass was carefully returned to its cabinet, the mansion slowly settled into its familiar silence. Employees worked side by side, clearing tables, folding linens, and restoring every room to its flawless appearance before midnight. Quiet laughter drifted through the kitchen as Bradley confidently repeated his version of the dessert incident, embellishing the story a little more each time he told it. By the end of the evening, several staff members were convinced Naomi had nearly embarrassed the entire household. She never corrected anyone. Instead, she quietly carried stacks of clean dishes to the pantry and thanked the pastry chef before returning to the dining room to collect the final arrangements of fresh flowers. Shortly after 11 o'clock, Victor Hale knocked gently on the door of Dominic Castellano's private study. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Dominic stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, his suit jacket neatly folded across a leather chair. "Close the door." Victor obeyed without asking questions. Dominic picked up a small remote from his desk and pressed a single button. A large monitor mounted against the wall came to life, displaying footage from the security cameras positioned throughout the estate. The recording skipped through the evening until it reached the narrow service hallway outside the ballroom. Neither man spoke. They watched Bradley step backward into Naomi's path. They watched another employee quietly roll the utility cart into the corridor at exactly the right moment. They watched Naomi steady the dessert tray with remarkable composure, preventing every plate from falling. Then they watched Bradley deliberately smear chocolate across the edge of one porcelain plate before pretending to expose a mistake that had never existed. When the recording ended, silence filled the study. Victor slowly exhaled. "So it was intentional." Dominic nodded once. "Every second." Victor folded his arms. "Should I dismiss Bradley tomorrow morning?" Dominic remained thoughtful for several moments before answering. "No." Victor looked surprised. "Sir." Dominic walked toward the monitor and paused the image on Naomi quietly cleaning the dessert plate without defending herself. "People reveal who they are when they believe no one important is watching." He looked toward Victor. "I did not hire Naomi because I needed another maid." Victor frowned slightly. In all his years working beside Dominic, very few decisions had ever puzzled him. "Then why did you hire her?" Dominic smiled almost imperceptibly. 3 weeks ago, I visited Saint and Community Center without announcing who I was. Volunteers were preparing meals after a severe storm damaged several neighborhoods. Everyone rushed toward television cameras and local reporters hoping to be noticed. He paused before continuing. "Everyone except one woman." Victor remained silent. "She stayed in the kitchen after everyone left?" washing dishes that someone else had abandoned. An elderly volunteer accidentally dropped an entire tray of supplies. Before anyone could react, she knelt beside the woman, helped her gather everything, and quietly told her that nobody should ever apologize for growing older. Dominic's voice softened almost imperceptibly. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience. She believed nobody had seen her. He looked once more at the frozen image of Naomi on the screen. But I did. Victor slowly nodded as understanding settled across his face. You were never evaluating her work. Dominic turned off the monitor, and the room fell dark once again. No, he replied calmly. I was evaluating everyone else. Downstairs, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding above her, Naomi finished polishing the final silver serving tray before switching off the kitchen lights. As she quietly walked back toward her small room at the end of the staff hallway, she believed she had survived another ordinary day. She had no idea that the true test had never been hers to begin with. Monday morning began like every other at the Castellano estate, but an unusual message reached every employee before breakfast. All household staff were instructed to report to the grand ballroom at exactly 9 o'clock. No explanation followed. By 8:55, housekeepers, servers, chefs, gardeners, security personnel, and maintenance workers quietly gathered beneath the towering chandeliers, exchanging nervous whispers. Bradley stood confidently near the front with his arms folded, convinced another routine announcement was about to begin. Naomi entered quietly through the side doors wearing the same neatly pressed navy blue uniform she had worn every day since arriving. She slipped toward the back of the room, hoping not to draw attention to herself. Eleanor stood beside the main staircase with an unreadable expression while Victor Hale reviewed a folder without speaking. At precisely 9 o'clock, the massive double doors opened. Dominic Castellano walked into the ballroom with his usual calm confidence, dressed in a charcoal suit that reflected the morning light pouring through the tall windows. Every conversation immediately stopped. He slowly surveyed the room, making deliberate eye contact with nearly every employee before speaking. Good morning. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried effortlessly through the silent ballroom. Last Friday, during our charity dinner, something happened that has remained on my mind. Bradley felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He assumed Dominic was finally preparing to address the mistakes everyone had been discussing all weekend. Dominic continued, I have always believed that a person's character is revealed most clearly when they believe no one important is watching. The room remained perfectly still. Dominic looked toward Victor, who stepped forward carrying a small remote control. Without a word, the large presentation screen behind the ballroom stage illuminated. Security footage appeared. At first, several employees looked confused. Then the familiar service hallway came into view. Naomi recognized it immediately. Bradley's confident smile slowly faded. Every employee watched in complete silence as the recording clearly showed Bradley stepping into Naomi's path. The second employee intentionally rolling the utility cart into the hallway. Naomi balancing the dessert tray with extraordinary composure. Then Bradley reaching toward one porcelain plate and deliberately smearing chocolate across its edge, before pretending to expose a mistake. No one breathed. When the recording ended, the ballroom remained absolutely silent. Bradley's face had turned pale. He looked around the room as though searching for someone to defend him, but every pair of eyes had shifted away. Dominic stepped forward. Naomi Carter. She looked startled when she heard her name. Yes, sir. Please come here. She hesitated briefly before walking to the front of the ballroom. Her posture remained humble, her hands gently folded before her. Dominic faced the assembled staff. Last Friday, this woman was embarrassed in front of guests because several employees assumed kindness was weakness and silence was permission. He paused long enough for every word to settle. They were wrong. Dominic turned toward Naomi. Do you know why I never questioned you? Naomi quietly shook her head. No, sir. Because people who seek attention usually defend themselves immediately. People with genuine character allow their actions to speak before their words ever do. Naomi lowered her eyes, visibly moved, but saying nothing. Dominic then looked directly at Bradley. You believed you were testing the newest member of this household. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. In reality, you were taking a test yourself. Bradley swallowed hard. Sir, I can explain. Dominic raised one hand politely. There is nothing left to explain. The cameras already completed that conversation for you. Around the ballroom, employees who had once whispered about Naomi now stood with quiet regret. Some avoided meeting her eyes altogether. Others remembered every careless joke, every dismissive comment, every moment they had mistaken humility for weakness. The room felt different now, not because anyone had spoken loudly, but because the truth had quietly removed every excuse that prejudice had been hiding behind. The silence lingered long after the security footage disappeared from the screen. No one seemed willing to move, as though even the smallest sound might interrupt the weight of what had just been revealed. Bradley stood frozen, his confidence replaced by quiet disbelief, while the other employees avoided looking at either him or Naomi. Dominic Castellano allowed the moment to breathe before speaking again. Every estate has rules, he said calmly. Some are written in manuals. Others exist because decent people choose to live by them. Respect is one of those rules. His gaze slowly swept across the room. No title, no salary, and no position gives anyone permission to diminish another person's dignity. He turned toward Victor Hale, who stepped forward holding a slim leather folder. Victor handed it to Dominic without saying a word. Dominic opened it briefly before looking back at Naomi. When you arrived here, many people assumed I hired you because I needed another pair of hands. Naomi listened quietly, unsure where the conversation was leading. That was never the reason. A ripple of surprise moved through the ballroom. Dominic continued. This estate has always valued excellence, but excellence is not measured by how loudly someone speaks or how important they believe they are. It is measured by consistency, integrity, and the willingness to do the right thing even when nobody is watching. He held out the folder toward Naomi. Miss Carter, effective immediately, you will become the household operations coordinator. Naomi blinked in confusion. Sir, Victor smiled faintly before explaining. You will assist with organizing daily operations, training new household staff, improving service standards, and reporting directly to Miss Whitmore and to Mr. Castellano when necessary. Naomi looked genuinely overwhelmed. I do not know what to say. Dominic answered with quiet certainty. Then say nothing. Continue doing exactly what you have already been doing. Eleanor, who had remained composed throughout the meeting, stepped forward for the first time. She looked at Naomi carefully before extending her hand. Congratulations, Miss Carter. Naomi accepted the handshake respectfully. Thank you, ma'am. Eleanor gave the smallest nod. You have earned it. The words carried more meaning than anyone else in the room fully understood. Around them, several employees who had once ignored Naomi now looked at her with completely different eyes. The elderly cook she had helped during her first week smiled proudly. One of the young servers quietly lowered his head, ashamed of every careless remark he had made. Even Bradley seemed unable to speak. Dominic faced the staff one final time. This promotion is not a reward for enduring disrespect, he said. It is recognition of leadership that was already present before any title was attached to it. He paused before adding, from today forward, every person who works in this house will be judged by the same standard. Character before status. Service before pride. Respect before assumption. The ballroom remained silent, but this silence felt completely different from the one before. It was no longer filled with suspicion or quiet judgment. It was filled with reflection. As the meeting came to an end, employees slowly began leaving the ballroom. Many paused beside Naomi on their way out. Some offered simple congratulations. Others apologized with nothing more than sincere eye contact. Naomi responded to every person with the same gentle smile she had carried since the day she first walked through the mansion doors. She neither celebrated nor held resentment. She simply thanked them and quietly returned the kindness they had once withheld. Watching from across the room, Dominic realized that the promotion itself was never going to be the greatest lesson the staff remembered. The greatest lesson was that the woman they had underestimated possessed something no position could ever create and no prejudice could ever erase. 3 months passed, and the rhythm of the Castellano estate quietly changed in ways that could not be measured on a schedule or written inside an employee handbook. The mansion still welcomed distinguished guests. Polished silver still reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers, and every hallway remained as immaculate as ever, but something far more important had taken root beneath its elegant surface. People greeted one another by name. New employees received guidance instead of judgment. Small acts of kindness no longer went unnoticed because Naomi Carter had quietly built a culture where respect became part of the daily routine rather than an occasional expectation. She never raised her voice to prove authority. She never reminded anyone of her promotion. She simply led the same way she had always worked, by listening first, helping whenever she could, and treating every person, from the head chef to the newest groundskeeper, with equal dignity. One crisp autumn afternoon, Dominic Castellano walked through the gardens after finishing a meeting with local charity leaders. The maple trees surrounding the estate had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the stone pathways. As he approached the greenhouse, he noticed Naomi kneeling beside one of the elderly gardeners whose arthritis had made it difficult to organize a shipment of flower bulbs. Without hesitation, she carefully sorted every box beside him while laughing at one of his old stories. There were no guests nearby, no cameras, no employees gathering to watch. It was another ordinary moment that no one would ever celebrate. Dominic remained where he was, unseen behind a row of hedges, allowing the scene to unfold naturally. After several minutes, the gardener smiled warmly and placed a grateful hand over his heart before Naomi quietly returned to the mansion carrying an empty watering can. She never realized she had been observed. Later that evening, Dominic found the framed photograph of Naomi and her grandmother resting on the dresser inside her modest room while maintenance staff completed a routine inspection. He paused only long enough to recognize the same quiet smile Naomi carried every single day. For the first time in many years, he understood that true strength had very little to do with influence, wealth, or reputation. It belonged to people who chose compassion when recognition was impossible. The following morning, Dominic gathered the household staff one final time, not for an announcement, but for breakfast. There were no assigned tables, no separate seating based on position. Every employee shared the same meal beneath the morning sunlight streaming through the grand dining hall windows. Naomi looked around with quiet surprise as conversations flowed naturally between people who had barely acknowledged one another only weeks before. Bradley approached her slowly, his expression sincere. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "I cannot change how I treated you, but I hope I can earn the chance to do better." Naomi offered the same gentle smile that had never disappeared, even during her hardest days. "We all have the opportunity to begin again," she replied. "What matters is what we choose today." Bradley nodded with genuine gratitude before returning to help another employee prepare breakfast. Dominic watched the exchange from across the room without interrupting. Victor stepped beside him and smiled. "You were right about her." Dominic looked around the dining hall where laughter now replaced whispers and cooperation had quietly replaced suspicion. "No," he answered thoughtfully. "She was right about people." Victor raised an eyebrow. Dominic continued. "She believed kindness could survive even where respect had been forgotten. I only gave her a place to prove it." The morning sun filled the room with warm light as employees cleared their own plates together, no longer separated by invisible lines of pride or assumption. Naomi picked up an empty coffee cup left behind by one of the guests from the previous evening, just as she had done on her very first day, and carried it toward the kitchen with the same quiet humility that had changed an entire household. Nothing about her walk had changed. Nothing about her smile had changed. The only thing that had changed was the way the world chose to see her. And on that ordinary morning, inside a mansion where appearances had once mattered more than character, everyone finally remembered what dignity truly looked like.